The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Poetry has been called the literary world's most precise architecture of language, each word deliberately chosen for its power to convey a maximum of meaning in a minimum of space and time. Poet Heather McHugh has spent her career crafting works in this most demanding of art forms. A professor of English at the University of Washington, McHugh's 1994 book Hinge and Sign was a finalist for the National Book Award for Poetry and named one of the year's best by Publishers Weekly. In 1995, she was one of just 10 writers chosen from around the country to receive a cash award from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
It's been a good couple of years for you as a
Certainly
poet.
Has. I come as a rich person.
Very unusual
very unlikely.
for a poet.
Yes.
We are having this conversation. It really is kind of a historic moment for your field, and that is that April of 1996 has been declared for the first time ever National Poetry Month. And it's a recognition of a real growing popularity and recognition of poetry. Do you know why this is happening?
No, except that every 25 years there's a kind of throwback, and it happened in the 50s too, or it's now 30, 40 years, but that was a long generation. I don't know particularly why. I mean, there's a National Carrot Month also.
I wasn't going to bring that up. There's a lot of recognition for a lot of things.
Yeah.
But there certainly is a new interest or a renewed interest. And as you say, these cycles go around, and I keep wondering if someone is going to do a study that examines what is it that makes it come together and push poetry to the forefront.
I think that people crave the economies and necessities of poetic language right now. I mean, we were just talking before the show a little about the sheer volume of language trash around. We're pelted with it. There's constant verbal noise. Poetry is the opposite of verbal noise. It's a kind of sounding done toward the soul, and there aren't very many homes for the soul, it seems to me.
As there's more noise, there's a hunger for quiet and for spareness.
I think people are quite desperate for it, actually. I mean, it's.
How did you get desperate for poetry? What drew you to it?
A horrible home life, misanthropy. I went to my room and wrote because when I tried to speak to other human beings, I stumbled or actually put my whole foot in my mouth. I couldn't get it right in the flesh. And the page was, I mean, it for me was very much a matter of finding the language for the bedevilment of passions. I think as I got older, it was more about having a passion for the bedevilment of language. That's probably the major shift that I've felt in the time I've been writing, but I was writing since I could hold a pencil, and believe me, they gave you huge pencils when I started writing. It was like a telephone pole or something.
You described yourself as the world's shyest child, and that poetry was an avenue to get out of that shyness and reach other people.
Yeah, although I can't say that at the time I thought, that's what I'm doing it for. The way on nature shows, they always say the bird is building the nest because next year he knows he'll need. And for me it was an impulse, a sort of incoherent impulse, the way someone rocks and sings to herself, I had a knack for words, that was clear. And a mother who noticed it and gave me notebooks with pens chained to them instead of dolls. But it was a way of getting to the human community. In a sense, I imagined the human community for whom those matters of the soul mattered.
I was so struck by the idea of this very shy child choosing this particular medium, because to me there's something about poetry that's so vulnerable and so naked, and it seems
only when it's published.
a very revealing art form to choose.
Well, it is, but you write within the mob of yourself. I mean, or within the universe of yourself. It's the vulnerability is to stand up in front of 100 people and read. But it isn't about you, finally. I mean, it feels vulnerable when you're young because you think it's about yourself. And I'm getting old and crotchety enough now to think it isn't, to be actually deeply uninterested in myself. One of the great Greek sages says, the important thing is to know thyself, and then one of the other sages corrects him, better to know other people. And in truth, the poem is a way to try to bespeak, just as anybody working in any medium that he loves and leaps through, tries to get at something beyond himself and beyond all of us. For me, that's really crucial. It's
some kind of search for meaning, really.
It's the only thing that enabled me finally to be able to get up in front of a class and teach, or to give a poetry reading in public. I mean, given that I was one of those morbidly shy ones.
But it's the perfect time to ask you to read one of your poems. We've talked about morbid fear, vulnerability.
Yeah, that's more of that.
This is a poem that I picked out of this book. And when we talked about this before the show, you said, oh yeah, people love this poem. And
the Spokane poem.
The Spokane poem. Why are some of your poems the ones that people gravitate to?
Well, oddly enough, one chooses for public reading quite different poems than one might choose as the ones one will love forever, if one loves forever one's own poems at all. I mean, some are more accessible on first hearing. I mean, a poem, the great poems bear many, many readings. Not all of them are accessible immediately on first reading. And there is there are two ways in which you enjoy poems, and one is among people as a social matter, and the other is alone in your room when you're in love and unrequited, or alone in your room and dying. I mean, people seem to need to buy poems in book form when they're in love and dying, which mercifully happens twice a life. So you can have some chance of a few people buying a book, but it's quite a different spoken medium than read. You experience it differently, and I don't know. You tell me why.
I can't figure it out.
Whether if
there were just some that hopped
after.
out of the book at me, and this is one of them.
I'll read it. The Size of Spokane. I should tell you too that this is one of the later poems. I, as a schlocko from way back, a person with a sort of moist, yea maybe swampy heart, I married in my middle age a most unsentimental man who defected from Bulgaria and has a sort of a salutary, cool eye toward matters of the heart. And his imprint is in some ways in this poem, since when he first arrived in America, he studied American language by watching TV, as many new arrivals do. And I would be puttering around the house because I've seen TV. I mean, if it's not PBS, I'm not watching. So I would lean in now and then out of the kitchen in the doorway and hear him muttering at the television. And I leaned in one day. It was quite a fierce muttering. I leaned in closer and closer and closer. And finally I heard him saying, "I hate the Michelin baby." And it was in that era that this poem was written. The Size of Spokane. The baby isn't cute. In fact, he's a homely little pale and headlong stumbler. Still, he's one of us, the human beings stuck on Flight 295, Chicago to Spokane. And when he passes my seat twice at full tilt this, then that direction, I look down from Lethal Weapon 3 to see just why. He's running back and forth across a sun-blazed circle on the carpet, something brilliant fallen from a porthole. So it's light amazing him. It's only light, despite some 3,500 people propped in rows for him to wonder at. It's light he can't get over, light he can't investigate enough, however many zones he runs across it, flickering himself. The umpteenth time I see him coming, I've had just about enough, but then he notices me noticing and stops, one fat hand on my armrest to inspect the oddities of me. Some people cannot hear. Some people cannot walk. But everyone was sunstruck once and set adrift. Have we forgotten how astonishing this is? Have we so practiced all our senses we cannot imagine them? Foreseen instead of seeing all there is? Each spectral port, each human eye is shot through with a hole, and everything we know goes in there where it feeds a blaze. In a flash, the baby's old. Mel Gibson's 100th comeback seems less clever. All his chases and embraces narrow down while we fly on in our plain radiance of vehicle toward what cannot stay small forever.
I love that poem. And you know, having you read it aloud was a completely different experience than when I read it myself.
Yeah. The voicing, for one thing, of course, it's better to have read it before and suffer the disappointment of the incarnation of the poet, since that's the less important thing. The more important thing is all the different ways the poem is read by hearts in different conditions. There's a sort of wonderful story that I love, that ending, toward what cannot stay small forever. And when I've read this in Spokane, they say, that's Spokane, because it's flying toward what can't stay small forever. And it's partly, of course, the child's future, but also the city, the perspectival thing. There's this wonderful story McLuhan used to tell, a true story of a friend of his who took his kid up in a plane for the first time, and the kid sat silent while he was buckled into his seat, and silent while the plane taxied out, and silent even as it took off and reached its cruising altitude, and then finally turned to his father and asked, when do we start getting smaller?
It's all a matter of perspective, I guess.
The physics of 4 foot tall people.
When I read that poem, I assumed that it was literally something that happened to you. And that's the way I look at a lot of poetry, that it's something that really happened and it's simply a rendering of the experience. But, is that true, or are poems just imagined?
The world occasions the poems. The literal matters in a different sense, actually, by then. There are all kinds of literal truths that are tedious to record and not of any moment. The truth,
a child running back and forth in an airplane can be tedious.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. It is, it's not, it's that we are alive that's amazing. It's not the necessary sequence of things. How much would you include if you were going to tell the truth? How could you possibly subdivide enough to get it all in there, what we call the truth?
One of the questions poets are always trying to answer. The book that you're reading from is Hinge and Sign, the book that I mentioned in the introduction. You can hold that up with that nice sticker that says National Book Award finalist.
I tried to peel that off because personally I think a gold one would have gone better with the cover photo, which I took and like very much. But.
In the introduction to this book, you describe it not so much as a labor of love as a work of wariness, the business of collecting 25 years of your work from 4 different volumes into one collection. What was the wariness?
Well, the wariness is of ever constructing, presenting a self. There's a sense in which when you make a selected poems, you are selecting a self to present. And my wariness is precisely of that, of self-regard, self-absorption. One has to keep remembering how much the poems are not about the poet, and not even in a way, they're about language to a certain extent always, but also to a great extent, language falls away in the face of what matters. And it's the kind of thing, actually, that you have to every day shake yourself back into remembering that the strangeness of life is what matters. It's so hard to recover that sense of the strangeness, that precious strangeness of being alive. It's a hard work every day in the face of what repeats, like Mondays, every 7th day named the same. It's very hard to recover, to shake yourself out of that sense of the predictability of things, the sayability of things, the endless repeatability of things. everything does only happen once, and you can't even say how many everythings there are. The endless is already here if we could somehow get our ends out of our minds.
Is the
Delicate way of putting
successful
it.
struggle to do that what makes poetry different? What gives it its timelessness and its immediacy? A good poetry.
Yeah, actually, the two words you just put together are wonderful, because the immediate, of course, is absolutely present right there, and the timeless we imagine as not being present. But how to get those both together? That is, I mean, it's the question of the ages of the sages. But it's accomplished in each human soul. It's capable of being accomplished every day. We have to almost wrench the time away from the worldly to get that other world back.
It's getting rid of that noise again that you were talking about when we were talking about why poetry is now so popular.
Yes.
It's a method by which people can do that.
Yes, I think so. I think so. It's that form of love. I mean, as a young poet, I imagined that the carnal forms, which now seem more ridiculous to me than they did, were the forms of love that poetry was about. And there was a lot of sassy early work, so I was quite embarrassed by that. I mean, it was hard to put any poems in from the early books because there was so much sass.
I'm going to have you ask you to read another poem. This is a 10-year-old work that you chose to include in this book, and it's not sassy. It's really quite different and very moving.
Yeah, this is almost exactly the anniversary of the death of a friend of mine. And this, I would say that this poem, which you also chose, was perhaps, it occasions the turning point in the work over all the years. This is where that sass, the sexual sass, turned to a knowing about the price of passion. The root of passion is suffering. Freud, presented with a copy of Wilhelm Reich's new book, The Function of the Orgasm, was said to have commented, "So thick?" I'm on that side of the mountain now, I think, and the poems pretty much fall out that way. Anyway, this one is called What Hell Is. It's from March 1985. Your father waits inside his spacious kitchen. He himself is corpulent and powerless. Nobody seems to know exactly how your illness spreads. It came from love or some such place. Your father's bought with 40 years of fast talk door to door. This fancy house you've come home now to die in. Let me tell you what hell is, he says to me. I got this double fridge all full of food, and I can't let my son go in. Your parents' friends stop visiting. You are a damper on their spirits. Every day you feel more cold. No human being here can bear the thought it's growing huge as you grow thin. Ain't it a bitch, you joke, this getting old? I'm not sure I should laugh. No human being helps except suddenly, simply, Jesus, him you hold. We're not allowed to touch you if you weep or bleed. Applying salve to sores that cannot heal, your brother wears a rubber glove. With equal meaning, cold or kiss could kill you. Now what do I mean by love? The man who used to love his looks is sunk in bone and looking out. Framed by immunities of telephone and lamp, his mouth is shut, his eyes are dark. While we discuss despair, he is it somewhere in the house. Increasingly he's spoken of, not with. In kitchen conferences, we come to terms that we can bear, but where is he? In hell, which is the living room. In hell, which has an easy chair.
It's a wonderfully evocative poem because as someone who shared an experience like that as well, when I read that, it was what was unsaid and how you could amplify every thought and action and sentence that made it so powerful.
For me, there's a kind of profanity about daily life at certain times. I mean, and everybody feels it after someone beloved dies. The tax papers spread in his family's house while he was dying. They had to do the taxes. The easy chair, to sit in an easy chair, I mean, even the words for things seem like
Mocking.
Cruelties, yeah.
Tell me, there is an image, I think, a popular image of poetry, sort of Byronic, where you're moody or you sit on a rock and inspiration strikes you and you write a poem.
Right.
I wanted to know what's the day-to-day discipline and work of being a poet. What's it like?
If you love it, as I say, what was a language for passion has become a passion for language. That's for me at the heart of the love. I just can't help having that knack and then being obsessed, I'd say, not conscientious about seeing what that knack means, the oddity of using language and what it can mean, and all of its failures and all of its attempts to somehow capture something bigger than itself. For me, it has to do with revision. It has to do with writing an incredible amount and throwing it away and writing again and writing and writing. It's like learning a language. It's like learning a language of the soul, but it involves a lot of drill and a lot of, indeed, one has, for example, from my point of view, it's a love of grammar is involved. How does the language work? What does that mean that we make it in nouns and verbs? A linguist, Benjamin Worf, theorized about the language about the English language, that the fact that we require in any sentence that describes the world a subject and a verb may account for why we make the kind of God we do. You can't have an act without an agent. So there's this invisible agent for some things. The lightning flashed, you have to say, as though they were separate things. But in experience, it may well be one thing. The language there is almost an impediment to grasping how you experience something. I have to fight the language almost every day.
There's the language, there is the reading of the poetry, either read aloud or to. One of the things that I never hear poets talk about is the text and the way it appears, which is one of the things that makes poetry so distinctive.
Absolutely. The
and
white
you're always
space,
sort of rearranging the lines.
I had to actually, for me there was a big, the world makes you a specialist, but I loved music and the fine arts and language and poetry, and at one time did all of them. The graphic arts were the last one I really hung on to those. The space around the poem is part of the poem. You are doing a kind of architecture. You used the expression at the beginning of the show. There is a shaping in space that really matters. And for me, that's one of the joys of it. Actually, when computers came and the monitor wasn't the size of the 9x11 page, it was very frustrating to me because I was used to that shape and the endlessness. That long poems are now being written is probably because everybody's using laptops. I hate to tell you this profanity, but in fact, the musical truth about poetry is it is equally wedded to silence, and the graphic fact about poetry is it is equally wedded to the space around it. It's always ending. It has line breaks. It's ending all the time.
Your comment about silence, to me, is the perfect introduction to the third poem I wanted you to read.
I'll be glad to. I'll mention one thing. A bunch of us went to Italy representing American poetry. When we got there, we found out that the Italians who wanted to talk with us were all translating contemporary American novels, and they started asking us questions instead of about the state of the soul in the world in America. They would ask things like, what does this phrase flat drink mean? Or, what does this mean, cheap date? We were really happy to be asked that by Italians. We thought, we know. And actually, the men and women among us disagreed. So we needed translators at home. But this poem is what he thought. I owe it all to Fabio Doplicher, the man to whom it's dedicated, and you'll see him in the poem. We were supposed to do a job in Italy, and full of our feeling for ourselves, our sense of being, poets from America. We went from Rome to Fano, met the mayor, mulled a couple matters over. What's cheap date, they asked us. What's flat drink? Among Italian literati, we could recognize our counterparts, the academic, the apologist, the arrogant, the amorous, the brazen, and the glib. And there was one administrator, the conservative in suit of regulation gray, who, like a good tour guide with measured pace and uninflected tone, narrated sights and histories the hired van hauled us past. Of all, he was most politic and least poetic, so it seemed. Our last few days in Rome, when all but 3 of the New World bards had flown, I found a book of poems this unprepossessing one had written. It was there in the pensione room, a room he'd recommended, where it must have been abandoned by the German visitor. Was there a bus of them, to whom he had inscribed and dated it a month before? I couldn't read Italian either, so I put the book back into the wardrobe's dark. We last Americans were due to leave tomorrow. For our parting evening then, our host chose something in a family restaurant, and there we sat and chatted, sat and chewed, till, sensible it was our last big chance to be poetic, make our mark, one of us asked, "What's poetry? Is it the fruits and vegetables and marketplace of Campo dei Fiori, or the statue there?" Because I was the glib one, I identified the answer instantly. I didn't have to think. The truth is both. It's both, I blurted out. But that was easy. That was easiest to say. What followed taught me something about difficulty. For our underestimated host spoke out all of a sudden with a rising passion, and he said, "The statue represents Giordano Bruno, brought to be burned in the public square because of his offense against authority, which was, to say, the church. His crime was his belief the universe does not revolve around the human being. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things. All things move. If God is not the soul itself, he is the soul of the world." Such was his heresy. The day they brought him forth to die, they feared he might incite the crowd. The man was famous for his eloquence. And so his captors placed upon his face an iron mask in which he could not speak. That's how they burned him. That is how he died, without a word, in front of everyone. And poetry. We'd all put down our forks by now to listen to the man in gray. He went on softly, "Poetry is what he thought but did not say."
It's an absolutely wonderful poem. When I read that poem, it made me wonder, how do you write another one after that? I mean, there's such completeness and closure, in a sense.
How do you live after somebody dies if you truly imagine the death? I mean, we go on as nobly as we can, as decently as we can among human beings. We try to give testimony to all those occasions of life. Death is a big one of them.
And may you continue in that noble work. Come back again.
Thank you.
Sometime soon.
Thanks so much.
Heather McHugh.
It's a pleasure.
The book, people should read it, Hinge and Sign.
Thank you, Marcia.
Really a fact.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.